So far, I am loving The Mandalorian. Welcome to my nerd world, a Star Wars podcast and show. Again, I am your host, Jon Justice, and I'm glad you're with the show again this week. You can always email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Leave a comment on YouTube if you're watching the show, and be sure to hit the subscribe button and like the video as well, and subscribe wherever you go and listen to podcasts if you are listening to the audio version of the show. As I mentioned last week, I went into The Mandalorian with sort of even keel expectations. I love the television shows so far that they've done, the cartoons. The saga films, the films are what I like the most about Star Wars, and I was just curious and had sort of middle-of-the-road expectations for The Mandalorian. And the first episode really did meet my expectations. Chapter 2 exceeded my expectations. And there's a couple of things that I want to talk about when it comes to The Mandalorian before we dive into the Rise of Skywalker information that we have to share. I want to talk about the overall vibe of the show and the things that I really liked about it, especially with that second episode, and a little bit about where potentially I think this whole thing is going. I also want to get into a little bit of the response so far of The Mandalorian and present a couple of, I guess theories is the best word. I've had some notes over here and a lot of articles and stuff to get to on the show this week. But I have kind of a theory about the fandom, nostalgia fuel, and the future of the franchise, and what might be the best course of action, at least from just the first two episodes and the success so far of The Mandalorian. What might be the best course of action for Disney and Lucasfilm to take moving forward when it comes to putting out the live-action content, whether that's television or whether that's the theatrical releases. And then we'll go down the road of a bunch of cast and crew information that got released this week about the Rise of Skywalker. I anticipate that the promotion for the Rise of Skywalker is about to kick back into full gear. We've got, we've got Frozen 2 coming out next weekend. Okay, so there's going to be some promotion for that, but I think more specifically to Star Wars, now that we are getting Jedi Fallen Order released today when this is being recorded, and then both the first two chapters of The Mandalorian out there, the pathway has been cleared for the full promotion of the Rise of Skywalker to get underway, because, as I mentioned last week, and so far this week, we still have not gotten an international trailer, which is unheard of for any of the Disney sequel trilogy movies. And we haven't gotten the first TV spot with new footage. That's the really big shocking part, is we haven't gotten any new footage of the Rise of Skywalker since we got the trailer. And it's well overdue based off the timeline of The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. Now, there might be a pretty rad reason for that, and I'll get into that a little bit later on. But let's talk about The Mandalorian. The Mandalorian... And Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni have said this in interviews, and said this in interviews leading up to the start of the show. But it really does hit you right in the nostalgia feels. It definitely has homages, direct visual connections to the original trilogy. The locations are incredibly similar. In the opening episode, one of the side shots of the speeders was lifted right from A New Hope when we first see Luke Skywalker and C-3PO, flying across the floor of the desert. There's some really specific shots, and I am going to be talking spoilers when it comes to Mandalorian. So if you haven't seen chapters 1 and 2, then you may want to skip ahead, because I am going to get into some details. But there's a shot, in fact, a whole sort of sequence in chapter 2 with the Mandalorian and Jawas that was, kind of a redo of what happened with R2-D2 in A New Hope. Now, let me say up front, I'm okay with all of that. This is a really interesting, fresh take, and giving us the same types of vibes that we got from the original trilogy, and specifically A New Hope. And I'm going to get into more of that in just a minute. But I really do like where the story is going so far. The Mandalorian character himself embodies already, in my opinion, everything that people liked about the mystery of Boba Fett, and yet has given him a different type of personality, even though we really never got to know Boba Fett apart from when he was a kid in the Clone Wars cartoon, and of course the little bit that we got of him as a kid in Attack of the Clones. We never really have seen Boba Fett in his heyday as a bounty hunter to kind of get what his general attitude is. But you're getting the vibe of Boba Fett. And in my opinion, what everybody loved about that character in The Mandalorian. But I love the fact that he is a very human character. He definitely is taking his Mandalorian religion, as he says in Chapter 2, weapons are a part of my religion. And the turning in of the precious metal in the first episode of the Basky. Am I saying that wrong? The Mandalorian metal that he ends up getting the pauldron made out of. It's clear that he is wanting to prove himself as a man. Maybe perhaps he hasn't yet, and he's vulnerable. He's not perfect. He's gotten his butt kicked a few times and had to be, rescued by the Ugnaught in the first episode. Visually, it's stunning. It looks like a movie. And it's the fastest 38 minutes in that first episode ever. I mean, I've watched the first episode 3 times now. I've watched Chapter 1 3 times, and I've seen Chapter 2 twice already. They both move really fast for being 38 minutes long and just feel like they're quintessential Star Wars. It is pretty clear that this is a TV show just in terms of scale so far and budget, right? We're sticking to various locations. We're not going out on big adventures, elsewhere yet, like you would in a movie. But that being said, I mean, that really does feel like A New Hope did. But it's also indicative of the style of show that this is, being sort of more of a spaghetti western type sci-fi. But again, so far, I'm really loving the show. And it's Chapter 2 that really got me excited. Okay, so this is where we get into spoiler territory. So, of course, the big reveal at the end of Chapter 1 was Chilota. I'm calling him Chilota. It's Child Yoda. We don't know the species of Yoda yet. The only other species of Yoda beyond Yoda that we know was Yaddle from the prequel trilogy. So I'm calling him Chilota, and Chilota is awesome. Obviously, in the final shot of Chapter 1, he's just utterly adorable, right? And then you get into Chapter 2, and it's a whole new ballgame. One of those things about Star Wars that just gets you, right? If it's done right, it provides those moments of wonder like the original trilogy did and like the newer movies do. But it's those little moments of him crawling up out of his basket and then, walking over seemingly to go and heal. And you don't know at the time. You kind of make your own assumptions. Going to heal the Mandalorian after he's been injured. And the Mandalorian has to go and put him back, and then he's kind of checking things out and wondering what's going on. There's been some commentary. Carl Weathers said that he's got a really interesting personality, and he's incredibly wise. So I'm expecting that we will be hearing Chilota talk sometime in the near future. That's my expectation, is that eventually we're going to hear him speak. But the moment came when the Mandalorian is trying to retrieve the egg, and the whole bit with the Jawas was just fantastic. It reminded me a lot of seeing the original teaser for The Force Awakens and the shot of the Millennium Falcon on that Thanksgiving 2014 teaser at the end of that. Taken from the escape off Jakku when Rey is flying the Falcon, and how your memory kind of messes with you, and you think to yourself, oh my gosh, I've never seen the Falcon make moves like that. And I remember having that conversation and saying those things on podcasts back then, when the reality was, yeah, we kind of had. We just never seen it done that great when it comes to special effects. We hadn't seen it done in a long, long time. But it was one of those moments. That's what those moments were with Chilota for me. And it was just this sense of wonder and just wanting the camera just to follow this little green guy around. And when he goes and uses the Force to stop that beast when the Mandalorian is trying to retrieve the egg for the Jawas, and that whole bit was just precious. The whole bit of the Jawas going and ransacking his ship. And again, these are things that we've sort of really bridged a huge gap for me. And this is what I want to get into. Having that Force element enter into the show. It got me thinking about what Dave Filoni has done, and this episode, chapter 2 wasn't directed by Dave Filoni, but obviously he's a whole part of the whole process. But it reminds me of how Dave Filoni has not been fearful of making those connections to other Star Wars, content, right? Rogue One, I love Rogue One. I think it's a fantastic film. The only thing that doesn't really totally adhere me to it is the lack of sort of the Force in it. My favorite moments in Rogue One are when we go to Vader's castle on Mustafar and when Vader shows up at the end. And I do love that whole movie. The space battle's awesome because I love vehicles, don't get me wrong. But when it comes to the ones that really, the scenes that really, I go, oh, this is so good. It's that Vader's castle scene, and it's the scene at the end with Darth Vader, as they're trying to make their escape when he wipes out the rebels. There's a moment with Jyn Erso when they're arriving on Scarif and K2SO. No, it's not K2SO, but they're trying to use the code, right, to get down through the shield gate to get to the surface of the planet. And Jyn pulls out that Kyber crystal that her mom had given her when Krennic showed up. And it looks like she uses the Force, and they make this very loose sort of connection that they get the approval maybe because Jyn was trying to tap into the Force, which, considering the way that the Force was opened up in The Last Jedi and how it's kind of in everybody, you just got to tap into it, that would make a certain level of sense, okay? So going into The Mandalorian, I was always under the impression that, okay, this show's going to be great. It's Star Wars. It's a Mandalorian. I've never been that much into Mandalorian lore, even though now I'm really getting into it, and I want to go back and watch Rebels, and I want to watch Clone Wars with the Mandalorian stuff now because I'm getting hyped for Mandalorian lore. But I wasn't anticipating getting the Force element, and then we got it with Chilota. And that's when I just fell in love with the show. Now, this is what's really interesting about it. So if you didn't know yet, Dr. Pershing, he's the dude in the glasses at the beginning of Chapter 1 when Werner Herzog is giving the Mandalorian details on the 50-year-old asset that he needs to go and get. And Pershing comes out and they have the discussion about getting him alive, but Herzog says, if you kill him, you can bring him back dead, but we're going to take half the fee. If you didn't know this already, the patch, first off, the clothes that Pershing is wearing are very similar to the clothes that Galen Erso was wearing on Edu when Krennic confronts him and the other scientists who worked on the Death Star. So they're scientist clothes. I think that was a given, right? But he's also got a Kimonian patch on his sleeve. And this was a patch worn by the clones. It was also a patch that was supposed to signify a connection with the cloning facility on Kamino. Okay, so what does this all mean? Well, we don't know yet. What do we speculate it means? That's where it gets interesting. There's been a lot of rumors that this show is going to tie into the Rise of Skywalker. I said early on when I saw the way that the schedule, the release schedule. So we're going to get a new chapter for The Mandalorian every Friday until the 18th. That's a Wednesday of December. That Wednesday, we're going to get the second to last episode. And then, of course, Thursday, The Rise of Skywalker opens up. And then you'll get the final episode the following Friday. Okay. So, let's ask a few questions and then provide some rational, logical answers. Why would you release The Mandalorian so close to the final movie in the Skywalker saga? Obviously, you're going to want to release it with a streaming platform, with Disney Plus, which is amazing. That makes sense. Okay, but you still go, boy, that's awfully close to The Rise of Skywalker. Why would you put out a second to last episode right before The Rise of Skywalker. Why not just take a whole week off unless the show ties into The Rise of Skywalker? And I theorized this when I first saw the schedule. Now that we have a little bit more detail, and I won't say what they are, but I do know that I do know a little bit about what happens in Chapter 3 from some people that saw it at the premiere in Hollywood. But there's the moment in Chapter 2 when Chilota walks over and the Mandalorian is trying to patch up the really nasty cut that he's got on his arm, right? And Chilota's going up there and he's trying to help him. You got to assume he's going to use the Force and heal it, right? That was my assumption. And the Mandalorian obviously is not familiar with the ways of the Force and is very confused by Chilota and what in the world he's doing with his hand and how he's making stuff float. So he's not understanding that Chilota basically wants to pull an E.T. move, right? Which, by the way, just a quick side note. Next time you go and watch E.T., watch it like a Star Wars movie. The E.T. species shows up in one of the Senate sequences in The Phantom Menace, right? Star Wars takes place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. E.T. comes to Earth in the movie E.T. in the 80s, right? When they go trick-or-treating, and E.T.'s in the white sheet, pretending like he's a ghost, acting like he's Gertie, the sister, when they're walking down the street, when E.T. runs into Yoda, he turns and goes, home, home, home. Okay, so a fun little Easter egg. You could think of E.T. being an actual Star Wars movie. It just takes place a long time in the future after a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Okay, be that as it may. I just found it was interesting that with that little tiny correlation and E.T.'s being in the Phantom Menace and they have the power to heal, we're now seeing that the Force has the potential to do that. There's also been some rumors that Rey may have that power in The Rise of Skywalker. That's been thrown around now for a long, long time. Okay. Be all that as it may, let me just sort of present the surface level theory of what I think might be happening here. We know we have a returning Darth Sidious Palpatine. And I think I talked about this last week, but again, why do we keep calling him Palpatine? He was Emperor Palpatine, right? I mean, he's Darth Sidious, but yet everybody calls him Palpatine. Anyway, I think I talked about it last week. But we know he's back. We know he's in some kind of chair, right? Based off of what we saw in the full teaser trailer. He's in some kind of mechanical chair, so he's probably old and decrepit. And I've seen some of the leaked photos as well. So now you have a Force wielder some 20-odd years out from the events of the sequel trilogy, who is being sought after, who has the power to heal, and he's being sought after by an individual that has who has a direct connection to a scientist who is wearing a patch that's significant of the only known cloners in the galaxy, and that is the creatures on, or the aliens on Kamino. There's a lot you can do with that. What if it's Palpatine behind the scenes? What if it's Snoke at the time? Mm-hmm. What if it's Snoke at the time behind the scenes who's trying to get his hands on Chilota because he knows of the power that's inside of him? Maybe we're even going to go the midichlorian route. Now, that would be a shock. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm not even saying I believe that it'll happen. However, if you're looking at a dead versus undead Chilota to get the power from him, perhaps there's a middle ground there. Well, if he's dead, we can still get his blood, and the midichlorians we can still pull from him, that kind of thing. I'm still very much under the impression that the Sith troopers in The Rise of Skywalker are going to be clones. I'm still very much convinced of that. And I know on the packaging it says that they adhere to sort of the dark side legacy. So I am very much wondering if what we're seeing in The Mandalorian is going to have a direct through line into The Rise of Skywalker that obviously has something to do with cloning. I'm not necessarily suggesting Rey is a clone. I don't particularly like that idea. I've stressed that before. Now, the idea that she was created through different individuals and modeled after somebody, but ended up having various DNA strands all attached together to make something truly special is a rather interesting concept. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that. It does sort of bring up the line from the teaser trailer of 1,000 generations live in you now, but we'll just set that aside. I do think that somehow cloning is coming into this, whether it's because it's for a new clone army, whether it's because that is going to be where Palpatine gets the ability to perhaps regenerate himself, or why he's been able to hang out as long as he has after however he survived being thrown down the shaft in Return of the Jedi. I'm really hoping, I'll be honest with you, I'm really hoping there is some direct connection there. And I love the fact that already with The Mandalorian, we get your nostalgia fuel. It feels undeniably like Star Wars. We are expanding the mythology because we got a Force wielder. I was not excited. I'd heard about the Yoda species being in the show a couple of months back, and I was kind of like, okay, that's cool, but I was not excited for it. I'm really excited for it now that I've seen Chilota. So we've got, the expansion of the mythology within the Force. We've got the Mandalorian, who's got his own religion going on with the Mandalorian, and there's clearly other ones, as we saw in Chapter 1. And we've got these prequel connections and a potential for a direct tie-in to the Rise of Skywalker. And again, I'll just pose one more what if, and then we'll dive into sort of non-story talk about the Mandalorian before we get into a bunch of the information that we got about the Rise of Skywalker this week. But it makes all the sense in the world to me that if there is a direct tie-in, then something big is going to happen leading up into the Rise of Skywalker that will drop in that Wednesday episode, the day before the Rise of Skywalker comes out. I think that would be a genius move on their part. I think they can do it without having to have it be that if you see the Rise of Skywalker but didn't see the Mandalorian, you'll be confused. What I think that they would do, and what I would hope that they would do, because it would seem stupid. It would seem stupid to make the Mandalorian required viewing to see the Rise of Skywalker. No, what would be cool, though, is it would be as a reward for the individuals watching the Mandalorian if they got a bunch of the backstory, so that when they saw the Rise of Skywalker, you went, oh, wow, I know where that came from. But if you're just an average moviegoer and aren't watching The Mandalorian, you'll still get a brief explanation of what's happening without seeing it in great detail. So, with everything that I laid out so far, including your thoughts about the show, what do you think about The Mandalorian so far? I know the majority of you who listen and watch the show are kind of like me, at least those of you that respond to me. You're more into the saga films and the mythology on that level, and while you like, the ancillary stuff, you're more into the movies. But I'm curious whether or not your opinion has changed on that. Email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment on YouTube, and just let me know what you think about it. Are you excited about Chilota? Are you more excited about The Mandalorian now and what they've done? What do you think about the possibility The Mandalorian could tie into the Rise of Skywalker, and how do you think those connections could be made, given the fact that we've got a scientist who's a cloner who wants to get his hands on a species that is Yoda that has some serious Force powers, even being a child. Oh, and one more point on that, by the way. So the Mandalorian calls him a child, and there's been a lot of people that have been a little bit confused over his age and don't understand. So we know that Yoda lived for 900 years, right? So obviously this species is aging at a much slower rate. Being 50 years old, he's not calling him a baby, he's calling him a child. And like I said, Carl Weathers certainly alluded to the fact that Chilota is going to speak at some point in time. So he's got a level of intelligence already to him, and he can already wield the Force. What's interesting about it, though, is if you look at the timeline, Anakin Skywalker was 45, right, in Return of the Jedi, which makes me laugh a little bit because I'm 47, and I look better than Vader did when that helmet came off. Or even when he was Force Ghost before they switched him back into Anakin at the end of Return of the Jedi. So maybe I look young or they skewed him old. I don't know. Maybe I'm just that old and I'm just unwilling to admit it. Anyway, so Anakin Skywalker at the end of Darth Vader, at the end of Return of the Jedi, is 45 years old. Mandalorian takes place 5 years after Return of the Jedi. there's your 50 years. Why is that significant? Because Chilota was essentially born around the same time as Anakin Skywalker. That's interesting. And what if there's groundwork being laid for the series of films that could potentially take place before the Phantom Menace? All right, I just wanted to throw that little nugget out there. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Leave a comment on YouTube. All right, let me give you my theory on this. So what I liked about The Mandalorian, and this is something I hadn't really thought about when it comes to the original trilogy. You have this group of fans, and but mostly fans that are like my age, those that grew up with the original trilogy. Certainly those that went and saw A New Hope in the theater as a kid. I saw it when I was 5 years old. But the nostalgia that our brain sort of feeds, gets the most dopamine from when it comes to Star Wars, is A New Hope. And so, therefore, a show like The Mandalorian is really sort of tapping right into that dopamine nostalgia hit. And I've seen a lot of guys and women my age who have been talking about how much they love The Mandalorian. And I firmly believe that's the reason why. But the original trilogy was a lot different than obviously the prequels and the sequels as well, and specifically A New Hope, because A New Hope had this grounding in reality because of the limited budget and the effects of the time that made it wholly relatable, right? It's a fairly simple film going to just a few locations, a lot of practical effects, and when you're on Tatooine, it certainly has this level of believability to it versus the fantasy part of it. When you get into the prequel trilogies, now we're getting a lot more into the fantasy elements of Star Wars. We have Jedi Knights that are essentially superheroes of the time. And then when you get to the sequel trilogy, we kind of get this mixing of the two in the sequel trilogy, and I feel like they've done a really good job. I feel like when it comes to The Mandalorian, when it comes to the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, live-action series, and to a lesser extent Cassian Andor, that this is probably going to end up being the last gasp of new content based on the original trilogy era. And the reason I say that is because fans like myself and those that grew up on the original trilogy now who have kids and are passing on Star Wars to their kids, we're all getting older. And so what Disney and Lucasfilm are doing right now is they're trying to secure future generations to Star Wars. So a show like The Mandalorian, which has all the nostalgia fuel for the original trilogy, older fans, Obi-Wan Kenobi is certainly going to do that. And that's going to bridge the gap, because not only are you going to be able to bring in the older fans like myself who have children and are passing on Star Wars to their kids, but you're also going to bridge the gap for those that grew up with the prequel trilogy. Okay. However, we're all getting older and we're not going to be here forever. So what Disney and Lucasfilm, in my opinion, are doing right now is they're feeding the oldest portion of the fandom in order to hopefully go and have them continue to pass on their love of Star Wars to the younger generations, right? So as we get a few years down the line, and probably more than a few years, the next 20 years, I think we're not going to see nearly as much material being created within the original trilogy timeline. They're really trying to zero in and tap in on that right now. Okay. One other quick point, and then we'll move on to some of the material we have and some of the creators and the comments made about not only The Mandalorian, but also the Rise of Skywalker. Something that stuck out to me specifically with the Disney Plus app, and it's the comparison of the Marvel, the MCU, to the Star Wars franchise and what they're doing right now. I don't think that Solo didn't meet expectations, right? I think that Solo didn't meet expectations for the same reason that the core characters from the first 4 phases of the MCU won't be in movies anymore, but they're going to be on the Disney Plus streaming app. Okay, so what am I talking about? All right. Marvel. Marvel, over the course of 10 years, puts out it's 4 phases, right? If I'm getting that wrong, I apologize. But the first 4 phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And we get these series of core Avengers saga films, right, spaced out. And in between all those films throughout the years, we get these individual character stories that have this common thread line that culminates into Infinity War and Endgame. Endgame is over. We're moving on to the next phase of the Marvel MCU. The characters, your Loki, your Hawkeye, your Winter Soldier, right? WandaVision, they're all going to end up on the Disney streaming app and probably won't be seen much, if at all, in the upcoming films. We're going to be introduced to new characters in the movies. And then we're going to go through this whole cycle again. We're going to go through a couple of phases. There's going to be core movies that take place, over the course of the next 10 years. In between those core movies, there's going to be these individual character films like we had with Doctor Strange and like we had with Captain Marvel. And then once those next handful of phases, those 10 years has passed, and we've had the equivalent of the grand Endgame in the next phases, then I imagine all those characters that we met, that we've now seen their arcs, will then go down to the Disney streaming app. So what does this have to do with Star Wars? I think the Solo didn't meet expectations for exactly the same reason why they're not going to make any more of those singular films for the most part with the characters from the first 4 phases. People were already familiar with Han Solo. This was another actor playing Han Solo. And I know there's different iterations that have spelled this out before, but I'm doing it again. Solo would have been much better had it gone directly to the Disney streaming service, or before Disney Plus, say Netflix. It would have been much better received than making it a theatrical release. That's where I think Disney screwed up. I don't think it screwed up because it was too close to The Last Jedi. I do not believe it's because of any sort of backlash of The Last Jedi that Solo didn't do well. Solo didn't do well because it was a character that people had already spent a ton of time with. So there wasn't any urgency to go see a new movie with him and a backstory on him when we'd already seen, A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and The Force Awakens, and an older Han Solo. So there wasn't any rampant desire to go to the theater to see a character played by a different actor in his younger age when he'd already been on the big screen a bunch. It wasn't new. So how do you explain Rogue One? You explain Rogue One because that was a bunch of new characters. People they haven't met before. It was attached directly to A New Hope, so it was really close to the movie that started it all. That's where I think Disney is going to be able to really guide Lucasfilm in creating content moving forward. Stick to saga films, right, on a every other year timeline like we did with the sequel trilogy, and then give us the ancillary stories like it looks like they are on the Disney Plus streaming service, and we're golden. Now, the difference is if Disney does go and do a saga films either set forward in the timeline after the Rise of Skywalker with new characters or going back in time pre the Phantom Menace to sort of Old Republic era, I think there is a possibility that they can replicate what the Marvel what the MCU did in making saga movies and having little individual movies in between. Maybe. The one thing that tells me they can't do that, though, is because the thing about Marvel is those characters are somewhat known by the general public and very well known by hardcore fans. They just hadn't seen iterations of them on the big screen in the way that the Marvel was presenting them. And Star Wars just doesn't have that luxury. Unless they start pulling out characters like Ahsoka, maybe. I think an Ahsoka one-off movie could do great. I actually think that a Mandalorian movie could have been fantastic. Because these are new characters, right? But again, that's a much more difficult thing for Disney to pull off just because you don't have that sort of, like, Ahsoka's not well known. And while Iron Man wasn't well known, I knew who Iron Man was before the Iron Man movie came out, even though I never read an Iron Man comic book. There's a lot of casual Star Wars fans out there that couldn't pick Ahsoka out of a lineup. So I hope that made sense, but that's kind of where my head landed. Let's take the older known characters in the timelines that we're aware of and put them on Disney Plus, and then let's take the big screen and use it for brand new saga films. Like the rest of the show, though, what do you think? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or feel free to leave a comment on YouTube as well. All right, let's go ahead and move on with the show.
Something inside me has always been there, but now it's awake, and I need help.
So Variety Magazine. We'll go here first. I got a stack of articles here and some points I want to share with you. Some really good stuff in here. Werner Herzog on why he didn't see Star Wars films for the Mandalorian role. If Herzog's career has taught viewers anything, it's to expect the unexpected, writes Variety. The legendary feature director and documentarian, known for his haunting narration and his film's widely eclectic subject matter, is set to portray a mysterious figure in The Mandalorian, one whom he says sets the story on its path by asking the bounty hunter to track a particularly dangerous individual. Now, isn't that interesting that they called him dangerous in the article? Jon Favreau approached you directly, writes Variety, for The Mandalorian. Why do you think he had you in mind, and why did you say yes? So Werner says this: I think there are two reasons. One, he's seen some of my performances as an actor and is completely convinced that I should be part of this new series. Second, I think it's a bit of an homage to my films and to my storytelling and to my way of putting emphasis on world stories. Fever dreams in the jungle, quasi-science fiction stories. I think he sees a kindred spirit in me. Variety asks, you've said before that you haven't seen any Star Wars films. Do you feel that affected your performance in any way? And Werner answered, no, it doesn't really matter. You see, it was a very lively exchange, man-to-man, so to speak, between Jon Favreau and myself. I was not tossed into unknown territory. I was very well briefed. I knew what was expected of me. I knew the interior landscape of the character, and I knew the exterior landscape. You shouldn't feel upset that I haven't seen Star Wars films. I hardly see any films. I read. I see 2 or 3 or maybe 4 films a year. This is the quote, though, that really stuck out to me, that I thought was really, really cool, and I wanted to share it with you. On future Star Wars and The Mandalorian, Werner Herzog said this: there's a new mythology, a new universe emerging, way beyond science fiction, and we haven't had such a thing very often in human culture and history. We've seen it in ancient Greek mythology, but not very often. I hadn't really ever thought of it that way. Now, you see it in things like Game of Thrones. And I think that's part of the reason why Game of Thrones is so popular. And I'm envious of that, by the way. I'm envious. Well, let me say that envious isn't the right word. I really respect that. When I was late to the game on Game of Thrones. We were down to the last. This was before the last season came out. I hadn't watched a lick of Game of Thrones, and I started watching it and was hooked like everybody else was who had watched it when it was released. Ended up binging it over the course of a month, and then watched the final season like everybody else did, which I didn't have a hard time with. I really loved those last 2 episodes of Game of Thrones, but be that as it may, it's not where I want to go. But I love the fact in Game of Thrones you have this sort of alternate reality based on Earth, kind of, but there's not a lot of explanation, at least in the show. I didn't read the book. There's not a lot of explanation, nor does there need to be, of sort of the grander world and how that all ended up that way. Lord of the Rings is very much that way as well. Now, Lord of the Rings is interesting because, and I won't get into the mythology, I don't know that much about it, but I've always just assumed that Lord of the Rings was sort of an alternate universe take on the history of mankind prior to the history of mankind. So there's very few entities that have gone out there and done that. Star Wars did this. But they did it in the sci-fi realm, right? Now there's a new mythology, a new universe emerging way beyond science fiction, and we haven't had such a thing very often in human culture and history. We've seen it in ancient Greek mythology, but not very often. right? So you see it, as he says, in the Greek mythology, but George Lucas took it and turned it on its head and changed it and made it different, made it accessible and fresh and new again. I think that really is one of the things at the very heart of the core of Star Wars that makes it so compelling. I was thinking the other day, so, I write my stories. I'm down to the last few chapters of EMBARK Book 3. Really excited to wrap it up. I may have it done here, and I may even have it done this weekend. I don't know yet. Probably not. Probably the next couple of weeks, because I've really just been kind of pacing myself writing it. And while it's based on the future and a future Earth, I really did try to adopt this mentality of hoping and praying that the audience is going to go on this ride and just sort of accept this real world scenario and let it play out. Science fantasy, not really, kind of, especially with the technology, but I really looked at the creators like Lucas and George R.R. Martin and Tolkien, and how as a reader and as a consumer of the product and going into the story, you allow yourself to be immersed into this world and you sort of accept it as the reality of the world you're living in. And it was a little bit tricky with the books that I'm writing because there is a level of realism because it did start on Earth, for crying out loud, still in the future. But as you get into EMBARK Treasure in Darkness and that kind of expands a little bit, I really did trust that, hey, those guys knew what they were doing. People accepted this was the reality of what they were faced with, and this was the story that they were telling, and I moved forward as such. And thankfully, when it comes to Treasure in Darkness, Book 2 in the EMBARK series, it ended up working really, really well. But I just appreciated those comments from Werner Herzog because I'm infinitely fascinated by the fandom of Star Wars, the positive fandom of Star Wars, and why we all love it so much. And it really just goes down to that power of belief, mythology, and taking you someplace else, but it's still relatable. And one more thing on spinning back to the Mandalorian again, there's moments in both chapters, both of the first two chapters of the Mandalorian, where I'm like, man, you could probably go to that location somewhere in California where they're standing right now. How amazing would that be? I mean, I can't wait to go to Galaxy's Edge next year, but on my bucket list of things to do in life, I would love to go to locations, real world locations that were used for Star Wars movies. I just think that would be just a blast, and it's something I've never done before. And really, I regret it, especially when I was born and raised in Southern California and never took the opportunity to go out to some of the desert areas, or even Arizona and Yuma, where they shot all the Jabba sail barge scenes. All right, let's move ourselves over to some Rise of Skywalker talk, shall we?
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
All right, we got a couple of different articles that I want to share with you. First one comes from Entertainment Weekly. Not much to go on, but still interesting nonetheless. Daisy Ridley has 4 words to describe the Rise of Skywalker. Entertainment Weekly asked for 3. But Ridley gave them 4 because she's an actress who literally gives 133.33%. I don't know what that means. Doesn't matter. So Ridley begins with this. Definitely dark. There are bits that are genuinely scary, she continues. So, dark and scary, says Entertainment Weekly. Cool. Then she says, and sad. Okay, that's 3. But the Disney sci-fi epic is now sounding a bit more like a horror movie. So, then she says, and joyful, she concludes. Dark, scary, sad, and joyful. There you have it. Okay. Look, I am fine with all of those descriptions. And that's kind of the vibe that I'm getting from the trailer. I don't think this is not I'm convinced now this is not going to be a Return of the Jedi 2.0. If you thought that The Force Awakens was a New Hope 2.0 or Original Trilogy 2.0, I see your argument, but it seems pretty clear to me that The Rise of Skywalker is not going to be Return of the Jedi 2.0. And look, I'm excited for that. I can see just based off of what I know of the film so far, although I'm calling a lot of those leaks that came out before in question. I think that there is probably some truth to some of those leaks. I'm talking about the Jedi Paxos ones and the stuff that MakingStarWars.net put out there and Bespin Bulletin. That being said, I'm also thinking that what I covered on a couple of shows on a show a few weeks ago about how perhaps these leaks were cobbled together from footage that was given to outlets to create promotional footage, and therefore the context is really key because the storylines aren't exactly how it plays out. I think that's probably more of the reality. So, look, all of it just gets me excited, and I'm fine with those three words describing it: dark, scary, sad, and joyful. I am down with that. All right, a couple of different articles came out, and I think Total Film magazine came out. One particular quote that I know many of you have probably read so far. If you haven't and you like The Last Jedi, you're very much going to be interested in this. Kennedy brought J.J. Abrams back on board to his surprise, according to the article that I have right here in my hands. I couldn't concentrate on 8 and 9 because I was trying to make The Force Awakens, Abrams tells us, explaining that he had little to say in the direction Johnson took the trilogy in The Last Jedi, but adding, nothing he was doing undid anything that I thought was where the story would go. There have been criticisms of The Last Jedi from certain portions of the fan base, especially regarding Johnson's decision to essentially wipe out the Jedi Order and to keep Kylo Ren on the dark side. I think the magazine kind of got that wrong, because that's not what the majority of the criticisms were, be that as it may. But Abrams seems to be on board with those things. After all, he's the guy who had Kylo Ren murder Han Solo, an act that arguably put paid to any future redemption. I have no intention of undoing stuff, Abrams assures us. So let me just go back here real quick, right? There, with the criticisms, Johnson said nothing he was doing, Rian Johnson, undid anything that I thought was where the story would go. I don't know how many times we need Rian Johnson making those comments before people believe them, but I believe them, and that's largely because I think that The Last Jedi is an absolute masterpiece, and I can't go and wait to watch it again. I had a dream the other night. I shared this on Twitter. So I had a dream the other night that for whatever reason, I was a part of the filming of The Rise of Skywalker. As a matter of fact, in the dream, I thought I was in the movie. And I was there on the set for my dream version of the final sequence of The Rise of Skywalker. And I was very confused seeing the script and not seeing my lines on the script. And I had to ask Daisy Ridley and Adam Driver. I'm like, why? Where are my lines? And they had to tell me, well, John, we don't think you're in this scene. And I was like, very sad. And I sat off to watch the final scene being filmed. That's not the funny part of my story. The funny part of my story is that the final scene in my dream of The Rise of Skywalker was Rey bursting into Kylo Ren's private chambers aboard a starship, ready to confront him. And when she bursts in, she looks around the room to see that Kylo Ren had a whole bunch of framed, photoshopped pictures of the two of them all around his room. He had a bunch of Reylo photos that he made. I swear, honest to God, I woke up going, that's hysterical. Rey bust in on Kylo Ren to see that he photoshopped a bunch of Reylo pictures. Now I want to see that. SNL, make it happen, because your bits right now suck. All right, let's move on. So there was another article, and somebody on Reddit was kind enough to go and bullet point all the things that were said about The Rise of Skywalker, and there's some really interesting comments in here. So J.J. Abrams says they decided against using a CGI version of Leia, as seen in Rogue One, or recasting the character. Now, that flies in the face with some of the leaks from Jedi Paxos and Making Star Wars. So just want to throw that out there. J.J. says he took inspiration from Rian to go for it a bit more, and made choices that are bold and surprising whilst keeping it connected to the previous 8 films. Kerry Russell says Zori is a survivor, Zori Bliss. The interviewer asked whether Poe and Zori have a romantic relationship. Oscar says that every relationship with Poe has a sexual element. But with Zori, things were left kind of messy, and there is some hurt there. Naomi Ackie, who plays Jannah, says that throughout the movie, each character comes in contact with the dark side in this new way. Kelly Marie Tran says people are going to find it really interesting how we, Finn and Rose, have evolved. Daisy said Maz's line from The Force Awakens, "The belonging you seek is not behind you, it's ahead," because it's Ben. Because it's Ben Solo. Is a line that is key to Rey's story. Daisy also says during JJ's first pitch for The Rise of Skywalker, there was something that Rey did, and Daisy told him that there's no way that is happening. JJ agreed and thought that it was a poor idea. I've no clue. Rey will do anything for love, but she won't do that. The issue has spread with Adam Driver. He praises JJ and Rian and says he tries to make Star Wars as personal as much as anything else. And with those directors, they take moments and they break them into pieces to make sure you're truthful. Yeah, there's been a couple of different quotes, really cool quotes, from Adam Driver, basically saying that people have been alluding to how he does these very sort of deeper characters and these more meaningful, if you will, whatever, films. And so they're kind of equating, all of his other theatrical work to Star Wars. And he's been saying, I treat all my movies the same way. Basically, and I'm paraphrasing, but Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams are artists just like anybody else. Why would I go and approach that job just because it's Star Wars any more than I would go and approach that job because it's done by Spike Lee or whomever? I really, really dig that. And I'm with a lot of people that have made comments online in reference to those words being spoken by Adam Driver, who say they can't wait to hear what Adam Driver has to say about the film once it's out. Adam also says he's under strict instructions to not reveal anything about Kylo's fate, even when the interviewer asks him how it felt to the end of a 3-arc film. The article describes it as Adam tensing up for fear that a probe droid might pop up and zap him. So, look, there's a lot of really interesting and compelling comments that were laid out there, and for me, it really speaks to how we don't know what's happening in this movie yet. I do think that, and I've read the leaks, I do think for a lot of those leaks, there's probably some truth to them, but I think that most likely they've kept a lot of the bigger stuff under wraps, and I cannot wait to see this whole thing play out here in the next few weeks. All right, one more quick item about Rian Johnson, and then we'll dive into your listener feedback.
When I found you, I saw raw, untamed power. And beyond that, something truly special.
All right, this announcement was made. We got Rian Johnson's Knives Out coming out here in the next few weeks. Premiere was just this week. As they prepare for the launch of their latest movie, Knives Out filmmaker Rian Johnson and producer Ron Bergman are beefing up T Street, their independent new studio. So T Street would be essentially Rian Johnson's version of Bad Robot, okay, for J.J. Abrams. Kiri Hart, Stephen Feder, and Ben LeClaire have been named producers at the company, which announced the hiring on Thursday. So Hart, Feder, and LeClaire will spearhead films of all sizes and scales, being champion storytellers themselves with distinct voices and building long-term partnerships with filmmakers. The trio will shepherd projects from inception through production to release. All right, so why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because in a statement, Johnson and Bergman said, "We wanted T Street to be a place where filmmakers would feel supported throughout the entire process." That thinking led us to Kiri, Stephen, and Ben, who we've been lucky to work with in 3 different capacities over the years. They're not only experienced producers committed to taking the best possible care of filmmakers and their projects, they also happen to be really good people who share our passion for making movies. Hart most recently served as Lucasfilm's Senior VP of Development from 2012 to 18. She formed the Lucasfilm Story Group, oversaw the creative development of all Star Wars content across film, animated television, publishing, gaming, immersive media, and theme parks. Johnson worked with Hart when the latter co-produced his Star Wars The Last Jedi. Hart has plenty of Star Wars experience, having also been a co-producer on Rogue One and a producer on all 4 seasons of Star Wars Rebels. Upon departing Lucasfilm at the end of 2018, Hart formed a producing partnership with Feder, who had worked on her team there. Hart is also a creative consultant on Pixar Animation Studios' summer 2020 film Soul, directed by Peter Docter. Post she will continue to operate. She's also consulting on several other Pixar projects. Feder most recently served as VP of Film Development at Lucasfilm, reporting to Hart. Prior to joining Lucasfilm, Feder was the Senior VP Production Development at Annapurna Pictures. Among the projects he saw was Richard Linklater's Everybody Wants Some, Wong Kar-wai's The Grand Master, and Harmony Korine's Spring Breakers. Okay, so what does this all mean? Well, only speculation at this point in time, but I do find it very interesting that Rian Johnson has started his own production company with Ron Bergman, and it includes 2 different individuals with direct ties and obviously still friendly with Lucasfilm, considering Hart and her work with Pixar. They all left on good terms, and Pixar's connection with Lucasfilm, obviously, right? So what does this mean? Well, I think this means that if you're excited about getting a Rian Johnson series of movies, I think we're still going to get that. That's what this tells me. When? I don't know. And now that we know that there's they have their own little production facility in place, Disney and Lucasfilm are looking at a 2022 release for the next big screen series. I think there's a really good possibility that we get a Rian Johnson trilogy that isn't necessarily directed from top to bottom by Rian Johnson, right? But maybe it's one that he crafts. I said from the get-go when they made the first announcement of Rian Johnson doing a trilogy that Star Wars needed like a George Lucas type. I think that George Lucas type has kind of been filled with a number of different people, specifically Dave Filoni. But when it comes to crafting an arc of a series, say it's a trilogy, you need a director out there and a writer that really knows their stuff. And I think that Rian Johnson is the perfect person for that. And I think the fandom's okay with that because even some of the staunchest critics against The Last Jedi, many of them have said time and time again that they would be fine if he would do his own set of Star Wars movies. They just didn't like what he did with The Last Jedi and the sequel trilogy of Luke Skywalker. And the fact that they've got the team in-house, they have the production company, that to me says they've got some wiggle room here to play with. There's no rush on this. If he's got a production house and they can do... I mean, he turned around Knives Out pretty quickly, given that The Last Jedi only came out a couple of years ago. So even if Disney waited for any more theatrical releases, I think that Rian Johnson has positioned his production company and his team as such of, hey man, whenever you guys are ready, we'll go. But, and I could be completely wrong, that news tells me that Benioff and Weiss leaving may have been a great thing for those of us that think The Last Jedi is fantastic, because I think that Rian Johnson now has a production house in place where he can arc out a series of films, maybe direct the first one, and then use his production team to go and find other directors to go and make the other films as well. So I'm really super excited about this, and the whole thing just makes me want to go and watch The Last Jedi. So what do you think? Again, TalkShowNerd at gmail.com, or leave a comment on YouTube. Really looking forward to hearing all your thoughts on the show this week, as we do every single week. This, of course, brings us to the listener feedback portion of the show.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
And thank you to everybody who's emailed talkshownerd at gmail.com and also YouTube. And again, like the video if you're watching on YouTube, hit subscribe on YouTube, or subscribe or like wherever you're listening to the podcast. I really would appreciate it. All right, friend of the show, Agnes, writes this. I've been thinking about Rian Johnson and Disney decisions and had some thoughts after I also read the piece by Martin Scorsese criticizing Disney specifically for diminishing the role of directors and undercutting creativity and risk-taking in order to produce bland form, non-complicated art such as Marvel. Rian said once that he was really nervous when he started working with Disney because he was afraid that would happen, but he was surprised at the level of freedom he was granted when crafting The Last Jedi. I think Scorsese would be pleased. However, I have a suspicion that the current negotiations Disney is putting in front of Rian a set of binding and limiting conditions that he doesn't necessarily like. He may not be finding himself in the Marcel-like setting where the director's creativity is limited by the studio. He may be finding himself there. Okay, he is already limited in the choice of the topic. This must be Star Wars. But it seemed to me that initially for this trilogy, he was given a whiteboard to do with it whatever he wanted. And then maybe Disney, not Lucasfilm, decided to control more. I'm not sure Rian will go the Marvel way. He might just as well go the Scorsese way. And it will be his choice, not a result of the backlash. Agnes, I'm going to make this quick. I think there's probably, that's a big possibility that what you wrote is true. For me, when it comes to the directors being let go of these projects, whether it's Trevorrow, Lord and Miller, even what happened with Rogue One, I always chalked up the directors being let go decisions to be based off of the quality of the product. Movies get released into theaters that are awful all the time. And yet they get released into the theater anyways and promoted and the public sees them and they hate them, right? Disney and Lucasfilm can't afford to do that with Star Wars. And quite honestly, none of the films have failed on a story level, on a storytelling level. I know people had their controversies with The Last Jedi, but it wasn't a quality of the film and the filmmaking part of it. It was story-wise, and that's subjective, right? However, you have other films out there where it's kind of less subjective. A film is bad. A film is bad, right? The more artful pieces are the ones that are controversial, and that's what The Last Jedi is, in my opinion. It's more art house than it is anything else. The firings of the directors, to me, always came down to just the quality of the product and a fear that they were heading down a path that they could not go and get away from. When it came to Josh Trank and the Boba Fett film, that dude was just a mess. That's a whole situation in and of itself. Lord and Miller, from what we know so far, it was a difference of creative choices. There was a script they wanted to work off of, written by John and Larry Kasdan. They wanted to deviate from that. They didn't want to have to be led by the hand by the studio and decided to cut their losses. They brought Ron Howard in, and it's a fantastic film. Who knows what happened with Benioff and Weiss? We covered that last time. But when it came to Rogue One, Tony Gilroy came in and helped rework that movie quite a bit. But Gareth Edwards still got the writing credit on it, for crying out loud. And it's still a fantastic film. I just think that the film probably was running slow. When they saw the finished product so far, it probably didn't have the pacing that they needed, and it wasn't something that could be fixed in the editing room, so they had to have somebody come in and do some reshoots. It happens all the time. But when it came to The Force Awakens, that movie turned out fantastic, and they hired J.J. Abrams back. There was no problems at all with Rian Johnson. So that's just my take, and Agnes, you might be absolutely correct on yours. Just wanted to share my thoughts as well. Gabriella writes this: thanks for reading my comment last week. I love how you do the podcast now. Thank you, Gabriella. I appreciate that. Jenny Reed says this: crazy excited for the Rise of Skywalker. Interested in the Mandalorian. I got the Disney Plus subscription. Bye-bye, Benioff and Wise. I just rewatched The Last Jedi, and it's a freaking masterpiece. I agree. Stephanie S. says this: John, I just wanted to say this new format is rad. Keep up the great work you are doing. I need to go to the movies tomorrow. I haven't been since It 2 came out. Rise of Skywalker merchandise, obviously where the money's being spent. Thank you for the comment, Stephanie. All right, Rebecca says this: great show. I have one question for you. You think that Ben will have to do great acts to show Rey his change and that she accepts him? This is my question. No, I don't. I don't think it'll take very much. I think the mythology of Star Wars is pretty simple. You're either light side or dark side. You turn to the light side, you're on the light side now. Right? Now, So in terms of great acts for Rey, I don't think he needs to do much. He just needs to turn to the light side. If he had done that on Snoke's destroyer, it would have happened then, but he didn't because he's a big, dumb man. I'm a big, dumb man. He wanted his galaxy and his Rey too, and he couldn't have it. No, I think that turning to the light side and assisting Rey and bringing down the ultimate evil is going to be enough for Rey to accept him for who he is. Now, there's still going to be a certain level of repentance that needs to be done, but that could just be something as simple as exile. And if he's exiled with Rey, then you know what? Hey, it's all good. Let's go to JW. You've done a really great job with this new format. Keep the crawl every week. Thank you. I love that. Like the green screen images in the background. I'm not sure how I feel about the TV series formats yet. I guess I just have to wait and see how it goes. As for the novels they keep putting out there, there's a lot of hit and misses with those. Some are good, but most are either bad or just okay, and I think a big part of that has to do with the writers they keep getting from England. I wish they would bring back some of the great writers they had back in the 90s when the EU was big. It seems as if the new writers don't really know how to write sci-fi. Thank you, JW, I appreciate the comment. Gala Cockatoo says, this, and I got your name wrong, I apologize. Really enjoy the new format. What I find most interesting is the easiness of your show. Even when you criticize, it's constructive and not annoying to listen to. My wife would disagree with you that I'm not annoying to listen to. That's not true. She loves me. I'm just kidding. All right. Like a lot. Oh yeah, not annoying to listen to, like a lot of Star Wars podcasts these days. Yeah, if you want to hear me be negative, hear me talk about other Star Wars podcasts. I can't help it. I'm a radio guy. I get judgy. I really do. I just. Can I make one? I'm going to make one criticism, and I'm not going to point to any particular show. One criticism, right? I get annoyed when there are main hosts of podcasts, Star Wars podcasts, whose knowledge of Star Wars is not near the depth that it should be for being a host of a Star Wars show. Okay, I just wanted to say that. I'm not going to say who. I still listen to their shows and they subscribe, so it doesn't matter if I criticize them. Be that as it may, if you're hosting a Star Wars show, you should know like a lot about Star Wars. Just my opinion. All right, B writes this. Have you seen the article on Siskel and Ebert? I still miss them. 36 years ago, defending Return of the Jedi from film critic John Simon's review of it, and the other two included. He blasted them and the people who went to see them. I feel they are so bad because they're completely dehumanizing. Both Siskel and Ebert took offense, making their what are you talking about comments. Then those years, Siskel said, these are the sort of movies the Disney people should be making. I think all movies are special effects. Movies are not real. They are two-dimensional. It's a dream. It's an imagination. So, as to whether this film is good or not, it excited me. It made me laugh. It made me thrilled, and that's what a movie like this is for. Also, suddenly, all this sneak preview for The Rise of Skywalker. I know they do these for people to get their impressions, but for some reason thought Star Wars wouldn't have to do that, though possible, I guess. Have never heard comments about that from other movies. Of course, the comments about how terrible the people thought it was. Just can't believe it. Thanks for all you do, B. Thank you for the comment, B. I appreciate it. Friend of the show, Skydrathic, writes this. Hi, John. I must say, I'm not nervous at all. Not any longer. After that teaser with Kylo and Rey, after the trailer with Kylo and Rey, after the hopefully epic music of that trailer, all capital letters, I'm not worried at all. I'm calm and happy for December. Why do I not believe you? I'm just kidding. That's a joke. Friend of the show, Jennifer Oliver, writes this. I'm seeing and hearing things in all of these trailers combined that puts me at ease. Listening to your show helps. Aw. 3 little words, but I do. It's going to be epic. Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate it. Kenneth Ashley writes this. Why aren't you on terrestrial radio, man? Great work, great voice. I am. And I replied to Kenneth and told him, yeah, for those that don't know, I'm a radio show host of 24 years. I started off doing rock radio in LA and Orange County and then bounced around the country, was in Atlanta, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Landed in Tucson for 9 years doing talk radio, and I've been here in Minneapolis for now 3+ years doing talk radio on the Justice and Drew show. So, yeah, I'm a full-time talk radio host. But thanks for the kind words, Kenneth. I appreciate it. All right, I guess I should probably talk about that more. I don't know. I try to keep those things separate. Mary Shepard writes this. Been listening to your podcast for a long time, but it's finally nice to see you. Thank you, Mary. I really appreciate your positivity. My 2 cents. Item number 1 on my Rise of Skywalker wish list is Bendemption, which I think is definitely going to happen. Reylo is my number 2 for me, but the totality of Rey and Kylo's interpersonal dynamics interests me, not just their potential romantic conclusion. Don't get me wrong, I ship Reylo, but I will enjoy their complicated, intriguing relationship, even if it's not overly romantic in the end. I'm 100% with you. It's kind of like a giant ice cream sundae. Now I'm intrigued and hungry. Right now, all the delicious ingredients are there in the Reylo sundae, except for the overt romance, which is the cherry on top of the sundae. I'll enjoy the sundae even if it doesn't have the cherry on top, but we want the cherry, right? Especially if you can twist the stem with your tongue. I've never been able to do that. Anyway, but it sure would be a nice finishing touch. Yes, it would. All right. I'm just so excited for the Rise of Skywalker and many more years of the galaxy far, far away. Peace and Reylo. Thank you, Mary. I appreciate it. Let's see. Jen G said this. Agreed. Chapter 1 of The Mandalorian. Time flew by. I loved the vibe, which was pretty much how it was described before it aired. I'll be watching it again as well since I woke up to watch it at 11:30 p.m. and that ending, right? All right, friend of the show, Ben Fisher, writes this. Heard your latest episode of the podcast, and you were talking about a Game of Thrones type show for Disney Plus that is Star Wars related. I think doing a show pre the Rule of One would give you that Game of Thrones feeling. The Sith were backstabbing, always looking over their shoulder, always trying to gain an edge, and the Jedi were just trying to stop them at every path. I think you could easily get that Game of Thrones feeling of each episode like a movie. A bunch of characters and different story paths. You never know who is going to live or die. I think that would be a ton of fun. I totally agree. All right. Echo Kill-11 Gaming says this. First chapter 1 of Mandalorian. Spot on Star Wars vibes. I foresee this being an amazing full series of Mando lore and great storytelling. Wow, what an ending to this first episode. Chilota. We get another episode on Friday or next Tuesday. Nope, it was today, and then every Friday, like I said earlier in the show. Thank you, gaming. I appreciate it. Andrea F. writes this. Still haven't watched it yet, but hearing your thoughts on it has me even more pumped to see it. My husband and I will definitely be watching after the wee one goes to bed. I can't wait. All right. Day Dia writes this, friend of mine. After watching The Mandalorian, of course illegally over here in Germany, I'm stunned. This is everything we've been waiting for since the first time a live-action Star Wars series was announced almost a decade ago. I can't wait to buy my when 50 years old you are, you're as cute as Gizmo doll. Thank you very much. Friend of the show, Tim Casey, writes this. I can't wait to hear your full podcast on The Mandalorian. Wait no longer. I listen daily to Justice and Drew. That's the radio show. So I heard your brief response. Here's a side question. I have 3 daughters who love Star Wars. They're 10, 9, and 7, and have watched all the Star Wars movies as well as most of the Marvel catalog. Do you think The Mandalorian would be appropriate? Yeah, of course, you probably watched it by now, but clearly it is appropriate. I was actually really surprised. I was expecting The Mandalorian to be a lot darker, but this one thing I didn't mention in my sort of commentary about it was how impressed I was at the fact that The Mandalorian, while it's an adult show, and I think it's geared towards adults, man, it's totally kid-friendly. I mean, yeah, guys, so good. I'm going to want to go watch it again. And it's good because I have one more email, and then we're done with the show, so I can. All right, let's see. Friend of the show, Dylan Gunther, writes this. Wanted to share briefly my reaction to the first episode of The Mandalorian. There was nothing that thrilled me, but I understand that this first episode has to set up the rest of the series. I thought the twist at the end of the episode was a fun surprise. I'm absolutely on board, and I see awesome potential for the upcoming episodes, which I'm very much looking forward to. Have a great weekend. For a reason, from EMBARK, Dylan. Thank you, Dylan. P.S. I've fallen a week behind on my chronological viewing of the movies. On the bright side, though, this gives me the exciting opportunity to watch Rogue One and A New Hope back-to-back this weekend, and I can't wait to experience this. Yeah, let me make one more comment, and then we'll wrap the show up, because I totally forgot that I wanted to bring this up. So, thank you for the email, Dylan. I'm a big proponent of physical Blu-ray discs. I haven't gone the 4K route yet, and I haven't gone the 4K route yet because of dollars. But I also haven't gone the 4K route because I've done a little research on it, and depending on the size of your screen and where you're sitting from the screen, the human eye can't detect anything beyond 1080p. I think it's like 10 feet from like a 60-inch TV, right? I think that's what it is, or it might be something a little smaller than that. So I'm big into quality of my watching. My wife will tell you I can't stand watching older DVDs on a Blu-ray player upscaled. It looks atrocious to me. And when the internet's not up to snuff and we're getting even slightly pixelated streaming, it drives me batty. So they released all the movies apart from Solo and The Last Jedi, which I think still have licensing rights with Netflix, but they'll be on there soon. Those are all available on the streaming service. The versions that we got of the Star Wars films on the streaming service are 4K transfers. Now, the prequel trilogies were shot digitally, so you're not getting a true 4K because you can't convert from the film from digital, but you still are getting a better color grading in the prequel trilogy, and I took a look at them. They look great. It's the original trilogy that's fascinating, though, because the original trilogy that we got is in 4K, even though it's not a physical release yet. They were created before Lucas sold Lucasfilm to Disney, and they were done for the 3D films. So they released the first 3D movie of The Phantom Menace, and it didn't do well in the theater. 3D version of it didn't do well in the theaters, and then right afterwards, Lucas, because they were going to release one. They were going to release them all in 3D eventually. And then Lucas went and sold his company to Disney. So the versions that we're seeing on the Disney Plus streaming app are the 4K transfers that were going to be converted into 3D. They look fantastic. For those that don't know, when the app launched, Lucas made another change in the bar sequence with Han Solo and Greedo, like right before they shoot each other, or Han shoots Greedo, and he kind of shoots first again. There's a little added line of Greedo saying McClunky. And it kind of just threw everybody for a loop, and everybody was talking about it on the day the app got released, and it was kind of ridiculous. But I just want to say that if you've got the app and you've got the physical versions of the movies, check out the streaming ones, because I'm on A New Hope this weekend in my chronological rewatching of the movies, and I'm probably going to watch the streaming versions, which I never thought I would do, because I have the Blu-rays, because they look fantastic. And particularly Return of the Jedi. There's a moment in Return of the Jedi on my Blu-ray when they first arrive on the forest moon of Endor, when they're peeking around the shrubbery. There's like this grading, this sheen on the picture. It just doesn't look right. I went and watched the ones on the app, and they look incredible. They fixed the lightsaber, kind of. The lightsaber, when they did the upscaling for the DVDs and the Blu-rays, the lightsaber, when Luke ignites it on the Millennium Falcon with the training remote, was green, and it drove me nuts. It's back to being blue lilac again, even though it's still not rotoscoped like a normal lightsaber would be now in modern days. But they do look a heck of a lot better. So go and check them out. And if any of you guys are film buffs like I am when it comes to picture quality, I'd love to get your 2 cents on physical release versus streaming release, 4K versus 1080p. I may not dive into it deep on the podcast, but I would like to hear some of your thoughts if you're like me and the picture quality is super important to you. That would I really would like to hear from you. So drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com, and leave a comment on YouTube. All right, as always, right, if you want to promote the show and you have not yet, or you got a friend that likes to read, go and pick up a copy of the first 2 books in my EMBARK science fiction space opera series. Details about the stories are in the notes for the podcast and the YouTube show. If you go to Amazon.com, search for Jon, Jon Justice, and EMBARK. You'll find EMBARK Book 1 and Book 2, Treasure in Darkness, available. Ebooks just 99 cents each, and then the paperbacks and the audiobooks are also priced as low as I can price them out there, just because I want to get the stories out to as many people as possible as I roll towards finishing Book 3. If you've already picked up the book and you've read it and you liked it, leave a positive review on YouTube. That's another way you can really help support the show. I really would appreciate it. And if you picked up a copy but you got a friend that likes to read, gift them a copy right there on the page. You can hit the link right there on the sale page on Amazon. And 99 cents, buy a friend for you. Say, hey, I listened to this guy's podcast. He's a big Star Wars fan. Here's sci-fi, and go read it. It's free. $1 for you, but free for them. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for checking out the show. Next week, we'll, of course, be talking about Chapter 3 of The Mandalorian, your listener feedback, and any news that takes place in the next 7 days. Thank you so much for checking the show out. Again, like the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel, and like and subscribe to wherever you listen to My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast. And I'll talk to you again real soon. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.